According to Russian President Vladimir Putin, the world is at risk of being taken over by an evil NATO force spearheaded by the US and its crazy European allies. In this idea that bounces around his head, it is the Russians who are the actual victims, because they will be made to kneel before NATO and watch helplessly as the West conquers the rest of the world. This rhetoric of the terrible threat that NATO poses to the people of Russia and the world is used as justification in the Kremlin's propaganda for crazy wars abroad, most notably in Ukraine, and strict censorship and opposition suppression at home. But to many people outside of Russia, the ludicrousness of this idea is plain to see. NATO has never declared war on Russia, whilst in the meantime, Russia is clearly happy to declare war on any neighbor who misbehaves. But this is all misdirection and misses the point. You see, if I were to tell you that Putin's real enemy has nothing to do with NATO, but in fact, the truth is that the real threats to Putin's power come from his inner circle and forces within Russia. Whilst he has enjoyed high levels of support from the general Russian population, it has rapidly decreased as the Ukraine invasion has gone on. At first, people were generally supportive of the war effort, but as it has taken its toll on the Russian economy and led to the calling up of hundreds of thousands of Russian men, much of the population is starting to run out of patience. Whilst many members of Putin's regime in the Kremlin have obediently sat on the sidelines for years out of fear of standing against him and out of knowledge of the public support he receives, the tides are now changing. Russia's reputation on the world stage diminishes every day as the country grows more and more isolated from the rest of the world. As the economy takes a beating from the Western-led sanctions, it relies more and more on China to prevent it from falling apart in such hostile conditions. But even China is starting to align with the rest of the world in turning their back on Russia for what is widely recognized as an unjust and brutal invasion. This may not have weighed so heavily on the minds of international leaders and Russian politicians if victory in Ukraine had come quickly and the cost was low. But months after the invasion began, little progress is being made and people are becoming frustrated. Whilst the initial aim seemed to be to capture Ukraine's capital, Kiev, the Russian forces are now barely managing to keep hold of the small parts of Ukraine in which they initially made advances. At this point, even those who enthusiastically supported President Putin at the beginning of the war have started to turn their back on his foreign policy. Criticism of Putin in Russia has always been tightly controlled, and the introduction of harsh censorship laws after the invasion began meant voices in opposition to Putin were almost non-existent in the early days of the war. Now, questioning the strategy and his leadership is becoming more and more common. People across the world were shocked when a handful of municipal deputies petitioned for Putin to resign in September. Publicly making such a statement, even if it did represent the wishes of many Russian politicians and citizens, is truly unusual in Russia, where such actions have been met by imprisonment or assassinations in the past. As the anti-Putin train gathers steam, though, the likelihood of someone close to Putin and central power taking matters into their own hands becomes ever more likely. Despite the fact that most of the people in the Russian government have been picked out first and foremost for their loyalty, there is only so much that ambitious people in the Kremlin will sit idly by whilst the window of opportunity continues to expand and Russia's credibility continues to be hurt. Outside of the consistently loyal subordination that Russia's higher-ups have shown to Putin until now, the Kremlin is a highly treacherous environment because of the ruthless ways that Putin has treated those who he has felt a need to scapegoat, even when they've done nothing wrong. Those around him know he is not to be trusted. They've seen too many ruthless imprisonments and accidental deaths to be able to ever feel truly safe around him. They are also often encouraged by Putin to betray one another, which is part of any dictator's tactics in stopping a cohesive opposition from forming. This means that those around Putin trust each other just as little. This excruciatingly hostile political setup is why any attempt to remove Putin from power would have to be swift and ruthlessly effective. Some might ask Putin to step down. A few years ago, it looked like Putin was seriously considering finding a way out so that he could live the rest of his life surrounded by stolen wealth without having to worry about the snake pit that he's created in Moscow. Putin isn't that far off turning 70, So when he pushed through constitutional amendments in March 2020 that made it harder for former presidents to be stripped of immunity, many analysts suspected that he was creating a legal safety net for him to step out of office. It's possible that he was initially inspired to consider resigning when he saw Kazakhstan's president Nursultan Nazarbayev step out of office after years of messy authoritarian rule. However, mass protests still arose a year later, and despite his planned escape, he couldn't get out of the accusations and public anger which was still directed at him. The hot mess in the government of Russia's smaller neighbor no doubt would have played a part in making Putin decide that it's safer for him to keep his power until the day he dies. But if he's here to stay and his rule keeps going as badly as it currently is, it is up to someone with the right connections and knowledge of Russian politics to make the move to oust him before the country's reputation is irreparably damaged. Who could be next up after Putin? Let's have a look at some of the main contenders who could take the plunge and put themselves next in line. A few months ago, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu would have been many people's most likely candidate to replace Putin. He is widely regarded as having one of the sharpest political minds in Russia, but the fact that the Ukraine invasion has gone so poorly whilst he holds the position of defense minister means that his record has been tarnished both in the court of public opinion and within the military itself. Even if he may have missed the opportunity, it is likely that whoever tries to replace Putin will need Shoigu's support. A temporary option could be Nikolai Patrushev. His role as head of the Security Council makes him one of the best positioned people in administrative terms to coordinate a power grab. However, he is unlikely to inspire much optimism among Russian politicians or citizens due to his age. He is even older than Putin. Still, a coup is unlikely to happen without him being on board. Vyacheslav Volodin has a similar claim as Patrushev. His role as chairman of the state Duma puts him in a strong administrative position. He has shown willingness for betrayal in the past when it helped him consolidate power, and those attributes would likely complement his control of Russia's legislative, which would be crucial in making any new government legitimate. Some figures have tried to remain in Putin's good books and soothe his paranoia by matching his rhetoric whenever possible. Russia's former president, Dmitry Medvedev, has at times even exceeded the craziness of Putin's propaganda, coming out with borderline genocidal remarks at times. He could be popular among those who like Putin's policies that are against his individual reign. For those looking for a bigger change in the Kremlin, though, Medvedev is considered either a fanatic or a joke. A coup headed by someone other than him is likely to try and get him as far away from the new government as possible. The current Russian Prime Minister, Mikhail Mishustin, was initially picked to fill his position because he follows orders and supports Putin whenever necessary. However, he has shown technical prowess in government before, and the prime minister position in Russia is the easiest one from which the politician could feasibly ascend to the presidency. Any of these figures are likely to lean on the support of Viktor Zolotov, the former bodyguard of Putin, as now head of the National Guard, and these boots on the ground will be very much needed if a change in hands of power is to happen. Putin has many security personnel that it is believed he can undoubtedly rely on, so any attempts to oust him will need support from Russia's security apparatus if they are to be successful. If Zolotov is ambitious enough and positions himself well, he may even launch the coup himself. The black horse of these political candidates to overthrow Putin is Sergei Kiriyenko. A liberal at one point in his political career, he's really been around the block, once filling the role of prime minister and now leading the oversight of captured Ukrainian territory. The fact that his name is so closely linked in the public mind to the Ukrainian invasion may undermine his ability to be different to Putin. However, if he is able to turn that situation into a means through which the opposition to the war, and Putin by extension, it is feasible he could garner enough popular and political support to mount a serious challenge to Putin's reign. What would happen if a coup were to start? Putin is acutely aware of the possibility that someone in his inner circle may try to replace him. His general paranoia has led to the arrest and disappearance of many opposition voices since the war began. The death of a leading oil executive who mysteriously fell out of the window after speaking out against the war effort is an indicator of just how seriously Putin takes the threat to his way of doing things. Since the war began, he has already purged almost 200 of his spies, a number which is far too high for them all to have been deemed incompetent. 2 senior officers in the FSB were put under house arrest in April, showing that Putin's been preparing for a political pushback since the early days of the war. There's no doubt that Putin feels like he's playing a game of whack-a-mole as the specter of a coup refuses to go away. The fact that Putin deployed a special unit of guards to Moscow at the beginning of October means that he sees a coup attempt right around the corner. Military units in Moscow are on high alert and have been bolstered by the elite Odon unit of the Russian National Guard. According to Ukrainian intelligence sources, blockades are even now being set up in Moscow. This all indicates that if someone were to actually take the brave step of trying to replace Putin, they would have an intense battle on their hands. It is impossible to predict how close this would be, but any ouster would need the support of leading members of Russia's security apparatus to have any chance of success. If they were to have enough boots on the ground to be successful, Putin's replacement would then have the difficult task of legitimizing the new government and garnering the support of the Russian public that still strongly supports Putin in many areas. The reversal of the disastrous policies towards Ukraine would be a quick and effective start for rebuilding Russia's reputation on the world stage, boosting Russia's economy, and returning conscripts home, which would do a lot to cultivate public support. Whilst NATO has refused to get directly involved in Ukraine, coups of this sort are something of a specialty and would be a decisive factor in helping to bring peace to Eastern Europe. In this way, the biggest threat that NATO may represent to Putin is by then potentially supporting a coup attempt by his inner circle. They have an unmatched ability to provide logistical and organizational support, and anyone in Russia plotting a coup against Putin will know that they are likely to receive backing if they reverse Putin's mad policies toward Ukraine. Putin's rhetoric makes it sound like NATO is a huge threat to the world. In reality, he should be worried about the threats coming from inside his own government, with a coup possibly just around the corner. But if his replacement can bring peace to Eastern Europe, then NATO may just be on board.